When we think of great North Atlantic shipping today, we think of ships like the Queen Mary II. Today she is the queen of the North Atlantic. She continues to transport passengers from New York to Southampton. We also think of the great ships that paved the way for her. These fantastic ocean liners included the Celtic, the Baltic, and the Adriatic, just to name a few. Later we would come to see the likes of the Mauretania and the Lusitania. These ships would claim the coveted blue ribbon on crossing the North Atlantic route from Great Britain to New York, the fastest. It would be Mauretania and Lusitania that would be the inspiration for what is perhaps the most iconic transatlantic ocean liner ever constructed. White Star's Olympic class of ships was inspired by these, Mauretania and Lusitania. The Olympic, the Titanic, and the Britannic were built as ocean liners that would showcase elegance and comfort rather than speed. It would be the second of these three sisters, the Titanic, who become most iconic. At the time she was built, the RMS Titanic was the largest moving object ever created by man. She would be doomed to sink on her maiden voyage on her way to New York. She would strike an iceberg, and in the early hours of April 15th of 1912, she would sink to the bottom of the North Atlantic. Now, the reason I am referencing the Titanic is because she has similarities to the ship that I'm going to introduce you guys to today, the SS Great Eastern. The SS Great Eastern was a modern marvel in her own right. Like Titanic, she was the largest moving object ever created by man in her day. She would be 692 feet long. She would be some 19,000 tons at her launch, and she had a capability to accommodate up to 4,000 passengers. She was very unique in that she had a propeller system, side paddle wheels, as well as 6 masts. Incidentally, some of her masts could also double as backup smokestacks. These characteristics made her quite the showpiece, to say the least. However, the ship was almost doomed from the start, and it was said that she was cursed. During her construction, a worker was presumed lost and allegedly fell into the compartment and was walled in alive. The intense noise of the construction would drown out the screams of the doomed worker. It would later be during a scrapping and breaking up that 2 skeletons would allegedly be found, one belonging to the riveter and one belonging to his helper. A sign of things to come also would be her launching in 1858, or lack thereof. It took more than a month to get her into the water so she could be fitted out. Another ominous sign was that an explosion on her maiden voyage took out a smokestack, and immediately she needed to be repaired. She would serve as an ocean liner for several years, crossing the North Atlantic from England to New York. She would also be responsible for installing the transatlantic telegraph cable, making communications much faster and modernized. She would later become sort of a sideshow attraction, littered with advertisements, and she would meet her end in 1889, where she would be scrapped in Merseyside. The SS Great Eastern was designed by Isambard Kingdom Brunel. She would be built by the John Scott Russell and Company at the Millwall Ironworks shipyard on the River Thames in London, England. Sadly, Isambard Kingdom Brunel would not live to see her prime, as he would suffer a stroke and pass away days before she was set for her sea trials. The SS Great Eastern's keel would be laid down on May 1st of 1854. Originally named Leviathan, she would later be christened the Great Eastern after being acquired by the Great Eastern Ship Company. This, after a long layup with the necessary funding to finish her running dry. She would have an iron double-hull construction. She had an estimated 30,000 iron plates used to complete her hull. The ship would have 19 compartments. She also had 10 boilers for her steam. Her propeller was 4-bladed. It was almost 24 feet across at its widest point. She was equipped with port and starboard paddle wheels, and these were almost 56 feet across. These paddle wheels could be powered by 4 steam engines. The propeller would be powered on its own engine, and total output was estimated to be around 8,000 horsepower. In addition to the engines, she also had 6 sailing masts. A total of 58,500 square feet of sailing could be used to further propel the ship. However, it would be later discovered that the sails were unusable when the ship's propeller and side paddles were in use. This was due to the hot exhaust produce excessive heat, which would damage the sails. The SS Great Eastern would have a maximum speed of 13 knots. Accidents during her construction would ultimately cost 6 workers their lives. On November 3rd of 1857, in front of a large crowd, the Great Eastern failed to launch. Her massive 19,000-ton hull was impossible to move. After more failed attempts, the Great Eastern would eventually be launched on January 31st of 1858. It would take another 8 months of fitting out. The ship's ownership would again change hands as funds would expire. The ship's coal consumption capacity would also be reduced, and the Great Eastern would be geared for use in the American market. The final adjustments and fitted out would be concluded in August of 1859, and it would be September of 1859 that she would set sail on her maiden voyage. Unfortunately, a steam incident induced an explosion that would kill 5 men. A closed valve would eventually be discovered as the culprit for the incident. It would later be yet under another ownership group where the SS Great Eastern would make her first transatlantic crossing. The SS Great Eastern's maiden voyage started on June 17th of 1860. She arrived in New York on the 25th of June, and she actually damaged part of the dock due to her size. The crowds that gathered to witness the ship could board the ship for $1 each. This was an extraordinarily high sum of money for 1860. She would leave New York bound for Cape May at Old Point, Virginia. However, a damaged water pipe would ruin the provisions for the journey. Later, as she planned to head back to England, the SS Great Eastern was to drop some 100 passengers off in Halifax. These plans would be interrupted as the Halifax authorities would charge $1,750 toll to enter based on the ship's tonnage. As a result, no passengers or visitors were allowed on the ship from Halifax. In the winter of 1860, the Great Eastern would be refitted and repaired. During the American Civil War, she would be converted into a troop transport ship. She would leave Britain and head to Quebec, carrying 2,144 soldiers. These soldiers were Britain's way of trying to intimidate the growing forces of the United States. The crossing took 8 days and 6 hours, which was a record at the time. Once returning to England, the SS Great Eastern would return to service as a passenger ship. Later in September of 1861, the ship would be caught in a major hurricane. Her damage included both her paddle wheels being torn off, and heavy damage occurred to her rudder. Her sails were shredded and also deemed useless, and a makeshift rudder was used to get the ship safely, powered only by her propeller. Later during a trip on August 17th of 1862, she would strike a rock bottom of Long Island Sound. On August 27th, the ship would strike a rock formation near Montauk Point. The rock formation, later named Great Eastern Rock, and it would cut into the hull. This produced a massive gash of 83 feet long and 9 feet wide. The ship would later have to be repaired in Cofferdam. The cost to repair as well as the operating costs of the ship would later see the Great Eastern laid up until 1864. It would be later in May of 1865 where, under yet another ownership group, the SS Great Eastern would set sail again. She would head to Sheerness and load wire cable for what would become the transatlantic telegraph. She would take on 13,950 miles of cable, so to make room, some of her salons and passenger rooms were converted into storage areas. In July of 1865, she began laying undersea cable. In 1866, she would lose the cable end and be forced to return with a new line. However, the lost cable would be recovered, and the cable made it to Heart's Content, Newfoundland, on July 27th of 1866. The Great Eastern would later be painted white in 1869 in an attempt to deflect the heat from the sun while laying cable in hot climates around India and Mumbai. Once the Suez Canal opened, it would be determined that the Great Eastern would not be able to pass due to her size, and as a result, she would have to go around Africa, and she would lose out to ships that were able to pass through the canal. The Great Eastern would later be sold on November 4th of 1885 at auction. She would again be sold again and later used as a floating concert hall. She would later be used as an advertising board, and she would be sponsored by Lewis's department store, who would own her at the time. The Great Eastern would eventually be sold for scrap in 1888. It would take 18 months to break her up at New Ferry on the River Missouri at the Henry Bath and Son Iron Works yard. It is noted that the information I provide is from James Dugan in 1952 in his book The Great Iron Ship. I have done a video on that book as well. Yet it has not been verified to this day about the recovery of any skeletons after the breakup of the SS Great Eastern. It is also worth noting that because of the strength of the ship, the invention of what had become the wrecking ball was used to break her up.
For the